Good morning and welcome to our special coverage of the Israel-Hamas war as the crisis in the Middle East continues. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Coming up today, Israel proposes 1-week pause in fighting in exchange for 40 hostages. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh due in Cairo for talks on new ceasefire. Plus, UN Security Council describes 2023 as the deadliest year in the occupied Palestinian territory as it describes it as it prepares to vote on Gaza. Thank you for staying with us. It appears there may be a little reprieve in the Israel-Hamas war if all goes to plan, with Israel's newly introduced proposal to Hamas that includes a week-long pause in fighting in exchange for the release of 40 hostages. First reported by Axios, the proposal looks to release the hostages that include women, the elderly, and those in need of urgent medical care. The deal is being presented to Hamas through Qatari mediators. Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Herzog, confirmed the country is willing to put a pause on fighting if it means releasing as many hostages as possible, but would not confirm if a deal had been reached. But as diplomatic efforts continue, the humanitarian crisis in the besieged Strip worsens with each day. Nearly 20,000 people have been killed by Israel's military action in Gaza since October the 7th, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, and more than 52,000 wounded, according to the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health. Much of northern Gaza has also been decimated by airstrikes, and according to the United Nations, almost 1.9 million people, more than 80% of the enclave's population, have been displaced. Meanwhile, the head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, is due in Cairo later for talks on a fresh ceasefire deal in Gaza. Egypt, alongside Qatar, helped broker a week-long truce last month that led to the release of about 100 hostages captured by Hamas in exchange of 240 Palestinians held in Israeli jails. Ismail Haniyeh, who is usually based in Qatar, is expected to lead the high-level Hamas delegation to Egypt to meet its intelligence chief. Last night, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, an ally of Hamas, released new video showing 2 older Israeli men that are being held hostage, pleading to be returned home. International pressure has been mounting for a new pause in fighting that could increase the aid sent to the besieged Gaza Strip. Now, the United Nations Security Council has met ahead of a vote on a proposal to demand that Israel and Hamas allow aid access to the Gaza Strip via land, sea, and air routes, but set up UN monitoring of the humanitarian assistance delivered. The United Arab Emirates drafted the resolution. The United Arab Emirates Deputy UN Ambassador Mohammed Abu Shahad has styled 2023 the deadliest year in the Palestinian territory. According to him, this should be a wake-up call that the current status quo cannot be allowed to continue.
We are now coming to the end of what was the deadliest year in the occupied Palestinian territory. This should be a wake-up call that the current status quo cannot be allowed to continue. 2.2 million people remain trapped, with 9 out of every 10 spending entire days without food. Gazans are experiencing unprecedented levels of starvation and thirst, while doctors lack even the most basic of medical supplies to treat the wounded and the growing threat of infection. What we need is access. The resolution that we will vote on later today aims to meet this need by demanding the use of all land, sea, and air routes to allow aid to enter. Israel must stop blocking the entry of aid and allow life-saving assistance into the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, less than 100 kilometers away from Gaza, people in the West Bank are living in a situation of violence and fear that has escalated over the past 2 months. Since 7 October, the number of people killed in the West Bank has increased. 278 Palestinians, including 70 children, have lost their lives. This is more than half of the total number since the beginning of the year, in a year that was already witnessing unprecedented levels of violence. Just because those with extremist voices shout the loudest does not mean that they should decide the fate of the region.
We are banning those responsible for settler violence from entering the UK to make sure our country cannot be a home for people who commit these intimidating acts. And we reiterate our call on Israel to immediately and completely stop all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory.
As this may be the last meeting for my country as member of the Council on this issue, just like we have said and repeated in every one of them, we look forward to the moment when the two-state solution is advanced, not like an empty mantra, not as an easy substitute to failure, not as a placebo, but as a genuine process so that the Israelis and Palestinians find the way to get out of the horrible deadlock, of the terrible impasse and the perpetual failures over decades, and together with the international community, design, agree and implement to live side by side, each in their own state, in dignity, prosperity and security, free from terror and insecurity. If not, even if this Hamas is dismantled, its ideology will remain, and if it's not abandoned or eradicated, plans will remain dreams, dreams will be crushed, and the harsh and unforgiving reality will perpetuate. And it will be, unfortunately, only a matter of time until the next tragedy unfolds.
Now, the video of the two hostages we mentioned earlier was released by the Quds Brigades. That's the armed wing of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The footage shows Gadi Moses, who's 79 years of age, and Gadi Katsir, who is 47 years of age, speaking in front of a camera, asking the Israeli government to arrange their release. Those are their pictures right there. It's not clear when or where the clips were filmed. For the clips. In the video, Moses asks Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, War Cabinet member Benny Gantz, and the Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi to make every effort to return them to their families. Katir makes similar remarks, asking the government to make an exchange deal with Islamic Jihad and highlighting the dangers they face. Moses was taken alongside his ex-wife, Magalit Moses, who was released during the truce on November the 24th. Katzir's father, Rami, was killed on October the 7th, and his mother, Hannah, was abducted and then released as part of the pause in fighting. Israeli forces carried out another dawn raid targeting the city of Tubas and the town of Tamun, resulting in injuries and detentions. That's according to the Palestinian news agency Wafa. It adds that in Tubas, many military vehicles enter the city from the eastern side amidst volleys of gunfire. At least 2 people related to released Palestinian prisoners have been detained. In Tamun, a 16-year-old was wounded in the firing by Israeli forces who were bulldozing 2 homes in the area. Meanwhile, in an official statement, the office of the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, says an immediate ban on Zim Shipping Company is in response to Israel's actions against Palestinians in Gaza. The statement says Israel is committing massacre and brutality against Palestinians. At the same time, Malaysia refusing passage for Israel flagged ships to dock in the country has occurred. In addition, Malaysia will also impose a ban on any ship en route to Israel from loading cargo at any Malaysian ports. The restrictions take effect immediately. Now, our guest today is security and defense consultant in Lagos, Mr. Onyekachi Adekoya, who joins us virtually from Lagos here in southwest Nigeria. Good morning and thank you for being with us.
Good morning and thank you for having me. Good morning to the viewers also.
Let's start with the reprieve that is expected if it's agreed, the proposal from Israel to Hamas that 40 hostages should be exchanged for a week's pause in the fighting. Is this an acceptable arrangement for now?
Well, Lumide, I'm not sure what to make of the proposal by the Israelis. We understand from what we're hearing that the Qataris are trying to broker a deal. Now, the concern is that if these hostages are released, as in the first instance when you had the first 1 week pause, that Israel perhaps will come up with more force, given that what seems to be restraining the Israeli army seems to be the fact that you have some of those hostages within the theater of operation. That acts as a bit of a restraint. So some analysts have argued that should Hamas release the remaining hostages, as sad as that sounds, that they may also lose any leverage or restraint they have over the Israeli army. Now, Hamas on his own part has also made some requests before this request for 1 week pause. We don't have any sense of indication that they are going to go ahead with that request from the Israelis. I think we've seen statements from also Hezbollah urging Hamas not to, I think the Houthis also urging Hamas not to accept the proposed 1 week cessation of hostilities by Israel. Yeah. Now the question is, what would be in it for Hamas or the Palestinians? I'm not sure. Maybe 1 week of reprieve may do a lot of good, but what happens after then? Now there are some also that also argue that the problem in the Bab al Madem Strait is also the reason why the Israelis are calling for the 1 week pause. There seems to be some logistical need to achieve a bit of a pause so that the actions of I think the US started an alliance grouping called Prosperity something within that axis. So there's an argument that the US also needs the pause to regather and properly retrofit the forces that are already stationed within that theater of action for further actions against the Houthis and to sustain operations in Gaza. So those are the arguments for and against the proposed ceasefire. From a humanitarian perspective, that would be fantastic by all means. We've seen the UN General Assembly resolution as calling for a permanent cessation of hostilities. You've seen the votes at the UN Security Council where you had a 13-1 and 1 split, majority favoring a cessation of hostilities. So it's clear that we need to find a way to stop the current, according to the words of Cyril Ramaphosa, the genocide in Gaza. Something has to happen. We're not sure where that respite will come from. So for me, I welcome a ceasefire by any means, but the Gazans have perhaps some concerns at this request.
Do you think, or how, rather, do you reckon that the political situation of the Netanyahu administration is being impacted by the pressure from the families of the hostages to engineer this particular pause in fighting? Because we understand there are about 19 women still held hostage, over 127 hostages according to the IDF, inclusive of 2 children, the elderly senior citizens, some of which you've just shown, and over 100 men, soldiers, young men, and civilians as well. That these people and their families, they're putting pressure on the Netanyahu government to engineer their release, as opposed which may run counter to the military objective of the IDF at the moment.
There is pressure, definitely. Olumide, there is pressure. There's significant pressure. If you look at the Red Sea Suez Canal route, that route already accounts for about 9.1 million barrels of crude per day. The Houthis are putting pressure on that axis. There's pressure coming also from Hezbollah. Again, that whole Red Sea Suez Canal route also accounts for about 12 point something percent of global trade. And that's currently under significant pressure. War is also not pretty. Back at home, the Israelis are suffering significant amount of casualties. Remember that Israeli population is not particularly very large. So any numbers 1 to 100 to 500 can become very significant for that population size. So there's pressure from the families who are losing loved ones at the front. We've seen a lot of videos of release of families not finding this whole incident very funny. And people are beginning to ask themselves questions. So what is the end state? What is the desired objective? What next? Okay, how do we go from here? And how do we not trigger a greater regional conflict? Already that regional conflict is already at foot. You've seen the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Force mobilize about 55,000 sea fighters to the Persian Gulf, armed with anti-ship missiles, making threats that also creates some form of pressure. So Iran is already involved or getting to be involved. The Yemenis are involved. Hezbollah is already involved. And tacitly, if you see the task force that the US put together, except for Bahrain, the entire Middle East seems to be, not wanting to stick their head out because of sentiments back in their own local polity. So there's pressure. There's pressure from everywhere. There's also pressure from the U.S. Because at the polls, the constant support for seeming support for Israel is also costing Joe Biden. It's costing the U.S. even globally. If you look at the whole vote that has gone out, I think a vote was put out also yesterday. A Russian proposition was put forward, and I think it passed by over 100 and something people. So you look at the Security Council, it's 13 to 1 to 1, one being US that vetoed, the other one being UK that has abstained. Understandably, there's pressure at home. So if you look at all the sentiments against the war globally, there's significant pressure. And yes, the people who are losing loved ones, even amongst the Israelis, are also beginning to kick. So there's significant pressure at home. We've seen reports of senior IDF officers being lost. I think about under 100 or something armored vehicles have been destroyed. Main battle tanks have been destroyed. This thing is taking a toll. It's now gone on for over 76, going on 77 days now. And Hamas is still there, still firing rockets into Israel, and they've not been completely annihilated. So there is pressure. Like I said, I think 2 weeks or a week ago on this show, the question is, what is the end state and how does this all end? So the toll, the civilian toll, is also very costly, even in local politics in Israel or even amongst the people in the Middle East. So yes, I do agree that the families who are affected, the families of the hostages, are mounting pressure, and even the families of military personnel being killed and being maimed is also beginning to take its toll on the polity. So yes, there is some pressure.
Does the perception of the military action in the Gaza Strip as genocidal or genocide fuel anti-Semitism around the world? You just mentioned in your last answer, you quoted Cyril Ramaphosa as describing the enterprise as genocide. Is that the reason why there's so much demonstrations of anti-Semitism around the world, or what can be interpreted as anti-Semitism? And is that a fair estimation of what the IDF is doing?
Yeah, the problem is that the world is in a state of global crisis currently. Whether you look at the Far East, Western Asia, Europe, even the US, there's crisis everywhere. There's Islamophobia. There's the anti-Semitism. There's the thing within the American community, black against white. We've seen a report of about, I think it was 4 or 5 youths, assaulting a white. So there are ultra-nationalist sentiments that are rising. The population demography in Europe has changed significantly. So you will have to consider the fact that there is a huge or significant Muslim population within Europe and in the UK. And that's also affecting sentiment. Even if you look at Ireland, for example, Ireland has been very forceful in their support for the Palestinians since the October 7 incident. Ireland also has a shared history of some form of brutality from, of course, the British forces and their experience with the UK government. There are various reasons for sentiments going all over at this time. Geopolitics, of course, some foreign influence operations, then the total loss of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the revelations that has proceeded even after the fact of what's been happening in Russia, Ukraine, and then the sentiments in the East. As an example, if you look at the UN resolution that passed at the UNGA, about 153 nations voted in support of the Palestinians. Those 153 nations account for about 85% of global population. Now, this matter is made worse by the fact that you now have more footages that are very gory that are coming out. In past wars, social media was not as a major player as it is today. You could easily control narrative through mainstream media, but people see every day the horrors of war. And again, under the doctrine of collateral damage, these things do occur. And that plays also into a propaganda narrative that is being pushed forward by Hamas, by some also foreign interest operators that also want to see ensure that Israel and ultimately the US suffer some strategic damage in this conflict. So there are a number of actors and actions that are playing up all these sentiments, some of them for local consumption, some of them for local political considerations, some of them for broader geopolitical calculations or permutations, as it were. So I wouldn't say that that's just the primary reason for the call for ceasefire. Like I said earlier, there are a number of factors going on. We need to be able to maybe get into the minds of the Israelis properly to understand why they are calling for this ceasefire. But one thing is clear, that it would not, the ceasefire as currently constituted, if it is not substantive, if it does not really lead to another type resolution 1701, in the Israel-Lebanese Lebanon conflict that led to some peace. If it doesn't result to a lasting peace, then I would assess that the Palestinians should have some cause for concern if it's just for 1 week. So the sentiments and the reason for those are just all over the place, if you ask me.
The collateral reaction from certain countries, one of which you've mentioned, Malaysia, who are banning Israeli docking of ships at their ports, and for the Houthi group who have, with all intents and purposes, by all intents and purposes, prevented commercial shipping heading for Israel in the Red Sea. Because of that, a number of shipping companies have now declined to use that route, choosing rather to go round about Africa on 2-week journeys to go conduct their business. So will there be more of a chain reaction amongst possibly these countries who voted against Israel for the withdrawal in Gaza that will affect the country?
Yeah, so this is a very good question with a very broader interplay of actions. Now, while we are mostly focused on Israel, the ultimate player that is at risk is not necessarily Israel. The biggest loser in this conflict is Europe, because the Suez Canal Red Sea route pours mainly into the Mediterranean, which then goes into Europe. The number of days of shipping swinging through the Cape of Good Hope would add, by some estimates, another additional 26 days to shipping. And that will increase significantly the already heightened case of supply chain disruption. Before the Russian-Ukraine crisis, the bulk of Russian gas and crude fed Europe. Now, post-Russia-Ukraine crisis, that Suez Canal, Red Sea route had seen almost times three, an uptick in commercial and trading activity. So that's a significant trading route for Europe. Should that route be blocked or over militarized? Already you've seen Maersk, you've seen BP, and a number of sensible shipping companies saying, you know what, we don't want to get to deal with, because there's a choke point. The Bob Almada Strait is a significant choke point. And the Houthis have a variety of advantages to target shipping and cause significant disruption. Now, the U.S. task force does not do anything good to that route other than over-militarize that group. As we've seen, for example, in Nigeria, in the mishap that happened in Kaduna, once you are within a theater of operation, certain mishaps can be very costly. A super tanker can cost upwards of 60 to 80 to $100 million with an additional cargo of that same value if one incident happens. So you look at the significant risk to even insurance company, to the shipping companies themselves, to the companies who have shipped cargo, and then to the intended recipient. So global trade is significantly being threatened and undermined. And you've seen the pressures coming from that axis now, causing crude prices to begin to nudge up. Any miscalculation happening either within the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Aden, or that Red Sea axis. If war breaks out there, then you can just see crude oil price can go up to as much as $150 or $200 per barrel. So the biggest loser will be Europe, because the US and has Canada is energy sufficient. The real party being threatened is Europe. Israel will get by and resolve its conflict. The Palestinians and the Gaza, they are not an existential risk to Israel. Now, will the companies, to your questions, adjoining that axis continue to blockade? Clearly, you must appreciate that the Muslim population is almost about, some estimates put about 1.5 to 2 point something billion across the world. The sentiment is strongly against the continuation of what is going on in Palestine as it is today. You then look at the moderates, the people who believe in ideals of human rights and who are anti-war, who support the anti-war movement. That sentiment is also rising. Then you also have the people who are just caught in between this whole geopolitical conflict. The people who are having to pay more at the pump price, suffering from the cost of living crisis, the commodity super cycle that is currently going on, and the fact that their government seemingly just seems to get on this prolonged conflicts that is not making any geopolitical sense to them at home. So those sentiments are what you are seeing coming to the fore, really pushing very hard against the continuation of hostilities in Gaza. The point has been made, if you ask any reasonable person, that the Palestinians have been dealt a decisive blow by Israel. Continuing on this path is clearly beginning to hurt the overall Israeli objective. So I think those are really the underlying issue, and the bigger collateral damage goes to Europe, really.
In other words, that's the way the cookie crumbles. Thank you for that answer. Now, the methods of Hamas as opposed to the motives of Hamas is what supporters of the Palestinians, as my last question to you, have with the group. Now, with 20,000 children, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, killed because of the Israeli military action in Gaza, how does one reconcile Hamas's methods, with Hamas's motives for a Palestinian-Israeli two-state solution?
In terms of, I mean, that's an argument of how the ends would justify the means. Historically, you can look at the Israeli-Lebanon crisis that led eventually to Resolution 1701 as, as the end eventually justifying the means. You can look at Ireland today, the fact that Ireland is now a republic, and is also almost like an outlier in Europe. You look at the Irish problems and the history of the Irish conflict and the fact that eventually they have their own republic. So those who are on the side, saying that, hey, perhaps Hamas has a case to make, and perhaps eventually, if you look at the sentiments, global sentiments now, then you could very well say that strategically, though the Israelis are winning on the battleground, they are losing the overall propaganda war. And that's what both of us are discussing right now. So would you say in this instance that the end justifies the means? That's not to say that we support in any way, shape, or form the dastardly act that happened on October 7th. But again, I'd made the case that based on evidence, what Hamas did was a surgical military raid with unfortunate and very regrettable collateral damage. The Israeli response to your question is also a proportional trigger, or proportionally triggered by the actions of October 7th. So if we condemn the military wing of Hamas, we should also condemn the far-right ideologues that are in the IDF who are insisting on collective punishment, because Hamas is holed up in tunnels. Hamas has very entrenched network. The ultimate people suffering the damage are those without arms, women, children, suffering the most. Has Hamas been degraded? Yes, but they are still firing rockets, and they will still fire rockets till today. So war is ugly generally, and very bad things happen in war. And that's why, the UN was set up in the first instance to ensure that the horrors of war are avoided, and the UN has different agencies. And I'm joining my voice to call for peace. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the parties will have to come back to the table. So there is no party that is justified in this conflict. Of course, I mean, with all due considerations of the fact that, you've had a constant quest for the two-state solution. You've had killings on both sides. But really, some of this senseless loss, if you forgive my word, please, of life, the meaningless loss of life can be avoided, and some understanding and agreement hashed out. So that's my response to it, really. Bad things happen in wars.
Don't let's get started on the UN, Mr. Adekoya. I will be here till the cock crows. But thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for your insight this morning, Mr. Onyekachi Adekoya, Security and Defense Consultant in Lagos State, who joined us from there. Many thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Still ahead, volunteers help children in Gaza deal with trauma amidst attacks. We'll have that story and more. Welcome back. The UN Relief Agency has released its daily update, noting that continued disruptions to phone and internet services in most areas of the Gaza Strip are severely affecting emergency operations and access to information. According to the United Nations, as at Tuesday, the telecommunications blackout had continued for 6 days, apart from a partial restoration in southern Gaza on December the 18th. Other updates include heavy Israeli bombardment from air, land and sea continued across Gaza, with the most intense shelling reported in Beit Hanun, Jabalia and Beit Lahia, all in the north. More than 360,000 cases of infectious diseases, including acute respiratory infections, jaundice, meningitis, impetigo, and chickenpox, have been reported in UNRWA shelters. The Freedom Theatre in Jenin, a popular symbol of peace and hope in the occupied West Bank, has experienced many attacks over the years. Most recently, the theatre, which provides artistic programs for traumatized children in the occupied West Bank, was raided, and on December the 13th, its director, Mustafa Sheta, and acting trainer, Jamal Abu Joas, was arrested. The pair are reportedly being detained in Megiddo prison outside the occupied West Bank, according to an update from Freedom Theatre, which also says this may be in violation of Article 76 of the 4th Geneva Convention. UNICEF spokesperson James Elder is concerned that children and families, according to him, are not safe in hospitals in Gaza. This is as the enclave's wider healthcare system teeters on the edge of collapse. Speaking in Geneva after a recent visit to Gaza, Mr. Elder added that over the past 48 hours, the largest remaining fully functioning hospital was shelled twice. The hospital, Al Nasir in Han Yunis, not only shelters large numbers of children who had already been badly injured in attacks on their homes, but hundreds of women and children seeking safety. It comes after a 13-year-old girl, Dina Mohsen, was killed by a shell that landed in part of the Nasser medical complex in southern Gaza, according to Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health in the Strip. Volunteers from Han Yunis have created a small haven in Gaza with a program that helps displaced children deal with the trauma they've experienced amidst the continuing Israeli attacks in the besieged enclave. At the central yard of the Jenin Boys School, they play and sing with children who come to the school with their displaced families. A volunteer, Dalia Elweya, says this helps flush out the negative energy from their systems in Gaza because of the war and aggression that they are living in. Now we speak to a professor of the Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos, Professor David Awurawo, who joins us virtually from Makoka in Lagos, southwest Nigeria. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you for having me.
One of the concerns, obviously, is the generational consequences of this war between Israel and Hamas. Aside from the children who have become orphans on both sides, the injuries that have happened to them on both sides, not just physical, but mental. This is something that needs to be dealt with, possibly for generations to come. Does this bring to the fore the need for a mediation that can have both sides come to terms with the need to stop this war, but in such a way as to also see that justice is served?
Yes, the psychological devastation of the young people in Gaza, and even in Israel too, to some extent, but more in Gaza, in the aftermath of the terrorist attack of October 7 and the Israeli military, attack as a response to it, is extensive. There will be the need for wide-ranging mental health intervention, counseling, consistent assistance by psychologists in the months and years after this war comes to an end. And like I've just said, it creates the imperative for why this war should come to an end as quickly as possible. I think both sides have fulfilled their objectives mainly,
Hamas wanted to embarrass Israel and show that it's still relevant. It has achieved that. Israel has, as much as possible, also, showed its power and created the infrastructure to, ensure greater security moving forward. And so now that they are talking about, the United Nations Security Council vote today, we hope it will be positive. We hope there will nobody to veto it. And they also, talks about negotiations, that will lead to ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire. We hope that they can build on that for something bigger, unlike the last one that the ceasefire only took charge of the need to release captured people, hostages, and shortly after that, hostilities resumed again. We hope that something more comprehensive will take place from today, from the Security Council and other interventions here and there, Qatar and the rest, so that there will be a ceasefire that will allow for humanitarian assistance, and then something to build on that may help to bring the war to an end. But the psychological issue is deep, is wide-ranging, and these are things that will create inveterate animosity for a long time. There's a study that was carried out by the Qatar Center that was published, I think, in 1990, which shows that in the aftermath of a war like this, animosity is always very deep. And, it creates the environment for another cycle of violence in future. But I think with effective psychological support, the negative impact will be mitigated.
With the latest offer on the table from the Israeli government, according to the reports that we have, asking for 40 hostages in exchange for a pause of a week in the fighting, does this ameliorate the situation to the point that possibly there may be discussions in the midst of that pause, if it's agreed, that will help to bring Israel to a point and Hamas to a point where there's some sort of compromise? But remember that Israel will not compromise on the October 7 terrorist attack in their country without asking for the for a just punishment of those that participated in that attack. Do you think that maybe separating the attack on October the 7th from the Palestinian safety and security is necessary for Hamas to do for Israel to come to the negotiation table?
Well, it is not possible to separate the October 7 terrorist attack from any other arrangement that is made after that. Israel's position, on that has to be appreciated and understood. Because what happened on October 7 is horrendous. And the Israeli government will not want that to happen again. And to be able to address that, the Hamas factor has to be brought there. Many of the leaders of Hamas have been killed already in the course of this war. Many of them are still there. There has to be a way that Israel will have a guarantee that the kind of thing that happened on October 7 will not happen again. And the Israelis cannot trust the Palestinians to provide that. Cannot trust Hamas to be committed to that. And so Israel wants to put in place its own structure so that it will be in control of its security, not on the basis of some understanding with either the Palestinians or Hamas. So it cannot be separated. But concessions have to be granted. Israel, like we have said several times, Israel cannot achieve everything it seeks to achieve in one war. Israel will not be able to obliterate Hamas in one war, and Israel will not be able to, put in place infrastructure that will make it control the security and everything in Gaza in one war. So at this point, I think Israel has done enough. There is need for concession now that will ensure that Israeli security is assured, and that will prevent the horrendous killing of civilians as we have seen play out in this war. The way Israel has gone about this war is not how terrorists are usually fought. Terrorists, there are ways of to fight terrorists is by identifying where they are and taking them out, not by bulldozing houses all over the place and killing innocent civilians. Almost 20,000 now and counting. I think it's a time for both sides to, come to some terms and concession so that, some stability can be created in Gaza to move forward.
So here's the thing, Professor. Charter 7 of the Hamas Charter and some other aspects of their charter call for the obliteration of Israel. There is no consensus. There is no Israel as far as Hamas is concerned with the way they're constituted as their memorandum of understanding between themselves. So how do you reconcile that with Hamas saying that Israel should withdraw from Gaza, and Israel knowing that Hamas have already had their officials on the record saying that they will repeat the October 7 attacks again, which is the reason why Israel say Hamas has to be totally taken out of the picture, in spite of how difficult anyone, or impossible, as many or most people think it is.
Exactly. These are issues that will need to be addressed in the negotiations that will take place. Yes, Hamas does not recognize Israel's right to exist, just like Iran, which supports Hamas, does not. These are issues that will need to be addressed. It is not possible for either Iran or Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, any of these groups to say that Israel does not have the right to exist, and that will be accepted as, what will happen. That is what has to be addressed. I mean, they should look at the devastation of Gaza. The question to ask is, do you want this war to continue? Do you want all of your people to be killed? Do you want, the Palestinians to be all exterminated? That is what should make them reason that Israel has to exist. As much as there are also, positions that the Palestinians do have a right to exist, and that the killing of innocent people, as Israel has done, is not right. These are things that will need to be discussed in the negotiations that will go on. And that is what we talk about, extreme positions on both sides. There are people in Israel who think that the Palestinians have no right to be in that place, that the land was given to Abraham by their father and all that, and that the land belongs to them. That cannot happen. The Palestinians have a right to live in that place. They have lived in that place long enough to be able to, have a state of their own in that place. Israel too has a right to exist. It is these extreme positions that we need to change. I didn't start today. In 1939, February, the British government summoned both the Palestinians and the Israelis on the possibility of having their state. The Arab delegation didn't even want to accept to sit on the same table with the Israelis. It has been for a long time, and that is the core of the issue in this conflict. And these are things that they must shift away from. The Palestinians, the Hamas, and all the other people on this side need to shift ground. They must allow Israel has a right to exist. The Israeli state has a right to exist, and they too have a right to a state of their own in the land. These are the things that need to be negotiated in the long run for stability to be maintained in Palestine and also in Israel.
Thank you so much, Professor. We do pray for peace. We hope that the year end meets an end to the conflict. We thank you, Professor David Awurawo of the Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos. Many thanks.
It's my pleasure.
Still to come on the program. Explosions over Gaza. The night sky as Israel fights to crush Hamas. More You're watching Channels Television's coverage of Israel-Hamas war. The sky over Gaza is a constant flare show as explosions continually go off. It's no different, and it was no different on Tuesday night as Israeli forces continued their bombardment of the enclave. Israel has dropped thousands of tons of munitions over the past 10 weeks, leaving the narrow Mediterranean Strip in ruins and killing nearly 20,000 people, according to Gaza officials, while many buildings are collapsing. Another 50,000 are injured, with almost no healthcare facilities working. Heavy civilian casualties are the cost of Israel's intense campaign to destroy Hamas in Gaza. Israel's top war aim is to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities to prevent further attacks and regrouping. And finally, at least 8 Palestinians were killed and 34 wounded in central Gaza after Israeli shelling reduced a home to rubble. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society, which is keeping tabs on the activity, released footage on Tuesday purporting to show a number of wounded people being brushed away from the scene to waiting ambulances in the central Gazan city of Deir al-Balaz Bishara neighborhood. The footage also appeared to show the body of a man retrieved from beneath the rubble. The location or the date or filming have not been verified. Under foreign pressure to avoid killing innocents, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the war will not stop until Hamas releases the remaining 129 hostages it is holding in Gaza and the Islamist group is obliterated. The United Nations Security Council vote to set up aid deliveries was delayed by another day on Tuesday as talks continue to try and avoid a third U.S. veto of action over the 2-month-long Israeli-Hamas war. And that's it for today's coverage as the Israel-Hamas war has entered its 74th day. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching.